steady wins the race. So we're going to win. We're going to win. I'm thoroughly enjoying this. We got 2 more weeks, this week and next week, in first chapter, and then hopefully I don't mess anything up here. And then we're going to jump into chapter 2. But I think this passage and the next one, especially the next one, are the ones people are like, "Why are you doing this?" And so we're going to have some fun and be a good time. Everybody doing all right? All right, you got your thinking cap on. All right, is your heart open? Just gonna pre-warn you. There will be an altar call today, just to prepare you. And immediately you can think, "Oh man, I hope this person goes." But my prayer for you is, and my hope, your prayer for you is, Lord, if I need to go, let me be open and let me be bold. If you want to do something in my life, and like I said, that's my prayer. Been my prayer all week. So Romans chapter 1, if you don't have a Bible, there's a pew Bible in front of you, and page numbers will be on the screen. We're going to look at a couple of verses today. And if you get there, if you don't mind standing as we read God's word together, if you can't, I totally understand, but if you're able, in honor of the reading of God's word, starting in verse 18. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of human beings who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over to their sinful desires of their hearts, to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie. This is big. And worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator. I feel like I needed that God, that Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Next slide. This is the word of God for the people of God, and you said, "Thanks be to God." You may be seated this morning. Let's bow one more time. God, we ask that you would have freedom, that you would speak, or that you might bring conviction. We often think that's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing, because it means you want us to be more like you, and you want to transform us to be more like you. And Lord, I want you to start with me. And the only way that's going to happen, God, is if you speak, not me, but if you choose to speak to us this morning. And that's very humbling. So Lord, I pray that God, the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing and acceptable to you, my rock and my redeemer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So this morning, next slide, we're going to be talking about sin and wrath. Woo! You're going to leave so encouraged today. And sin and wrath, two negative words. But I think once we get to the end, maybe we will have a different opinion. So the first word, next slide, that we're going to look at is sin. And what sin is, and maybe what it isn't. And this is so important because it's going to set up the rest of the book, right? Like we talked about last week, the big 2 verses, 16 and 17. And so this is going to set up how we hear the rest of what Paul might be saying. Now, next slide. Does anybody know who this is? Young fellow, there he is. Young chap. Next slide. This is Jonathan Edwards. If you're ever on Jeopardy, now you know. And Jonathan Edwards is very, very popular for one sermon. You probably could tell me, some of you. Sinners in the hands of an angry God. Ring a bell? So this is what Jonathan Edwards says in this sermon. Hold on. God holds you over the pit of hell, much as he holds a spider, or as one holds, sorry, not God, one holds a spider or a loathsome insect, this guy hated bugs, over the fire, abhors you, and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like a fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. Everybody said amen. And when he said this, been there? Spit. Of course, spit flies out of my mouth every Sunday, so I don't know that that's anything different. Maybe there's a replay happening in your mind of a service you've been in. Nobody raise your hand or point fingers or anything. Where the gospel was preached this way. Now, Edwards does get to grace. Okay, he does get to grace in the sermon, but I feel like that to understand God's wrath that way, maybe not what Paul was trying to talk about. Let's get a little bit of this. When I was in a wee little tot and a wee little guy in children's church, I remember this lady. Her name was Loretta Adams. Was doing flannel graph. Anybody remember flannel graph? I'm gonna bring that back. We're bringing it back. And flannel graph. How awesome is that? And I don't even know what story she was telling, but she started talking about hell, and she didn't get real loud. In fact, she started crying, just weeping. She's like, I don't like to talk about this place. It breaks my heart to know that maybe some of my family, some of my friends, is going to be there. And so when we talk about it, it was popular one time to get really animated. This guy named Michael Bird said it this way: to preach on wrath and isolation from a well-rounded biblical theology will reduce salvation to buying fire insurance rather than seeing salvation as participating in the very life of God held forth in Christ. And so if we have spit and fire coming out of our ears when we talk about it, then people are like, I don't want any part of that. You're calling people away from something rather than to something. That's what he's saying. So when one speaks of divine wrath, it should not be done with an angry voice or with fists pounding a pulpit, but with eyes welling up with tears and hands wide open, as if one were begging a suicidal son or daughter to come down from the ledge, recalling as well that God does not delight in destruction of the wicked, but I think this is scriptural, desires that all people to be saved. Too often we point fingers and we hurl and we get real fired up. And people are like, all right, I don't want any part of that. But we forget that there's actually a life that God calls us to live. A way, yes, but two, maybe even more so in what that looks like. Maybe you've heard this before. It's the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Okay, and the question was, what is the chief end of man? What is the chief end of man? Now, the answer is not to not go to hell, just in case you were wondering. The answer for the chief catechism of the Shorter Catechism in Westminster for what is the chief end of man is this: man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him. That's what the gospel is, right? That the chief end of what we are to be about is to not isn't that we're not going to a place. It's what we are to do with everything that we are, and that is to worship God and to glorify Him and enjoy Him forever. Now, I believe this is nuts and bolts. This is why were you created? To glorify God with everything that you are, and to enjoy Him forever. Like you weren't created to work in where your job. You weren't created to your chief goal, the chief reason you were created, and from the very beginning, which we're going to talk about, was to worship and glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Now, I really believe this gets at the heart of what this whole gospel, this whole message of the Bible is entirely all about. And this will be a review for some, but for some it will not be a review, and it's always good for me to rehash this and what this looks like. Because I think what's happening in Genesis 1, 2, and 3 is hugely about what this is all about, what sin is all about, and what this looks like. So as you know, I like to draw this stick guy, and he is getting better, if you can. And it's my addition to him. And so we talked about that in Genesis 1 and what this whole thing is about and what this whole thing looks like and what I believe, what it means to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And so we talked about how, excuse me, what this means is that we have this open, honest relationship with God, and we have this open, honest relationship with others. And we don't talk about this a lot. That's why I'm not a teacher. That's why I'm not a teacher too. With creation. And then the biggest one is with self, that these relationships that God created us for, and that what the Christian life is not necessarily a list, but it's relational and it's understanding. And then when we break that relationship, we're breaking down what it means for the reason God created us to begin with. And if this is and what it means, and this is mind blowing, maybe not. This is what it looks like to be a human. This is the way God created us. He created us to be who he wanted us to be, and this is the way he created us. And so our goal is not to be superhuman. Our goal is not to be above human, if that even makes sense. Our goal is not to be more than human. Our goal is to be who God created us to be. And he created us to be human with all of these right relationships. And you say, why is that important? Because I think that sometimes when we look at sin, the big word sin, we start to create these lists. And next week, there's a list. Some of you are not excited. Come back anyways. I promise I'll try to make a list exciting. But there's a list of all these things that Paul talks about that are potential sin. But sin big, what it is some people this guy named A. Trey Dunning who taught at Tribeca Nazarene University. A. Trey Dunning said sin, his definition of sin was disbelief. That God says, this is how I want you to live, but I don't believe that you really know what is right for me, so I'm going to go live life my own way. Another guy said it's unfaith, that I don't have faith. One guy called sin disobedience, that God, this is the way God told me to live and who God told me to be, and I'm going to disobey who he wants me to be and how he told me to live and go live life my own way. And it all boils down to who's going to be God? You going to be God? Or is he going to be God? You realize that he told him to not eat one fruit out of a garden full of fruit. Just one. And they decided, actually, a creature, which Paul talks about, tells them that there's a different way, there's a better way. Don't listen to him. But you can be your own God. And you can know right from wrong. And you can do your own thing. And so sin all boils down to is, am I going to trust him? Or am I going to trust my own self? Now, this is going to keep building, I hope. Okay, so this guy named Timothy Keller, who's a pastor in the church, it's called Church of the Redeemer in New York City, Manhattan, and a big church there. And this is what he says. What happens when people refuse to acknowledge and depend on God as God? So what happens? We do not stop worshiping. The chief end of man is to glorify God and worship him and enjoy him forever. We do not stop worshiping when we choose not to live that way. We simply change the object of our worship. We must worship something. We were created to worship the Creator. So if we reject him, we will worship something else. Dr. Greathouse and Dr. Lyons, former general superintendent, says this: creatures will devote themselves to some Lord. The only question is, who or what will it be? Our lordship determines our character, the quality of our lives, and our destiny. Some people say, you become what you worship. You become what you worship. And so in verse 25, Paul says they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and they worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator himself. Rather than the Creator himself. Dr. Dr. Busick, who's general superintendent, says that the definition of an idol is this: anything in your life that gives you identity, meaning, and worth other than God. It's very quiet. Is it quiet because I told you there's going to be an altar call at the end? Should I not have led with that line? Is that what we're doing here? Definition of an idol: anything that gives in your life that gives you identity, meaning, and worth other than God. It's an idol. A lot of times we think of idols as like a little Buddha statue, you know what I'm saying? Or like, we rub his belly. No, we don't, but other people do, rub his belly. And or an idol of like the golden calf, which was an idol. And so we think, well, I don't have any of those laying around my house. But you got a job. There's an election coming up. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that. There's and listen, job's not a bad thing. Job's not bad. I got a job. Not bad. But if it takes the place, if your identity is wrapped up in promotions and how much money you make and what kind of car you drive, what kind of house you have, if that's your identity and everything you do, you're worshiping that image of what that means for you. If your identity is in who God's created you to be, then guess what your life might look like? God, whatever it is, all my life, it's all for thee. Others, yeah, let's forgive. Let's be in good relationship with other people. Self, yeah, self. God, do whatever you want in my life. Doesn't matter. I'll serve you with everything that I am. Tim Keller's not going to be on the screen. Says this: the things we serve will not free us; they control us. We have to have them. And then he goes on to say, the main problem of our heart is not so much desires for bad things, but our over desires for good things, our turning of created good things that God has given us into objects of our worship and our service. Now you say, what does this have to do with sin? What does that have to do with sin? Because all of those things that maybe what sin ultimately is that we are subhuman. We are less than what God intended for us to be. We are worshiping all of these other things with our lives, and you say, "Yeah, but Jeremy, I really don't." But where's your identity? And anytime our identity is in something else, and we cling and we worship that rather than who God has created us to be, we are being less than who God intended for us to be. Oh, I love it. So N.T. Wright says this, next slide: the Jewish insight that regarded sin, living in a less than human fashion, missing the mark as regards to God's intentions for human creatures as the result of worshiping something other than the Creator. You realize, we talked about this before, but sin in the Bible it's an archery term. There's a mark you're supposed to hit. I look like Deshaun Watson right there. He does that every time he throws a touchdown. There's a mark. Sorry, I'm like all over today. And here's the mark. And if you're not hitting this, sin. Sin. That's the mark that God has for us to strive for and to try to hit. So exchanging worshiping God, the chief end of man is to glorify God. Exchanging that for an idol, we exchange what it truly means to be human in the way God created us to be, and it's a distorted version of what that looks like. And so Paul's view of sin, once more, is not this list of things, of breaking these arbitrary things, although those things are bad. But I think it all boils down to is God has given us an understanding of who He wants us to be and how He wants us to live. And those things are just subplots of me deciding that God doesn't know what He's talking about. I know what I'm talking about, and so I'm going to choose to do these things because I think they're actually better for me than God knows what He's better than what God knows. Subhuman, non-human behavior, unfitting for who God has called us to be. So people are full, Paul says. Their hearts are darkened, Paul says. And they're full of all kinds of evil because we choose to listen to a serpent in the garden above and beyond God. We choose to listen to that rather than living into the plan and the desire that God has for us to worship Him with everything that we are and to not have anything between us and anybody else. let self be the Lord, but to let Jesus be the Lord. So, why is this important in relation to, next slide, God's wrath? Well, let's go back to God's wrath. I think that's where I want to go next. Why is this important in relation to the wrath of God? It's a great question. So let's go back to Romans chapter 1. So I have the NIV translation, and it's actually the TNIV translation. And in verse 18, my version says, the wrath of God. It just starts with the. However, this is a bad translation. I'm sorry, I read a bad translation in this one. I set you up. And because in the Greek, there's actually another word before the, and the word is for. For the wrath of God. And you say, why is that a big deal? Because I think what this word does for the wrath of God is it actually combines verse 17 and verse 18. Verse 17 is where Paul talks about God's righteousness and what that looks like being revealed. And then he says, for the wrath of God. And so it ties God's righteousness to his wrath. Now, we talked about last Sunday that God's righteousness is not just something that happens at the end, but it's something that we continually are part of, and God continually calls us and shapes us to be more like him. And I think the same is true for God's wrath, that it's not just this something that's going to happen in the end, but it's something that continually happens, and what that looks like. And so Dr. Greathouse, once again, and Mr. Lyons, Dr. Lyons says this, the two revelations of the righteousness and the wrath of God. And these verses are really two aspects of the same process. I love that. The preaching of Christ crucified, risen, and ascended, and coming again is at the same time both the offer of God's righteousness to believers and the revelation of God's wrath against sin. In the gospel, divine mercy and divine judgment are inseparable from each other. The mercy offered us is no cheap grace or a superficial pardon, but God's costly redemption. The reality of God's wrath is not truly known until it is seen in its revelation in Gethsemane and on Golgotha. Oh, that's a mouthful. Here's what I think Dr. Greathouse is trying to say. That what we see on the cross is God's righteousness revealed through his son, Jesus Christ. And what we see in the cross is God's wrath against sin and destruction and the judgment of the world. I think it may be a problem with context once again, and not Paul's context, but our Western mind context and what it looks like. Now, when we hear the word wrath, or maybe I won't throw you under the bus, I'll just throw myself. When I hear the word wrath, what I think wrath looks like is well, it's not good. You know what I'm saying? Like it's like when my dogs run away and they shouldn't have, and it makes me want to put on the zapper collar that we have and turn it to full blast. You know what I'm saying? Like wrath. You know what I'm saying? Like I feel bad for porters because they probably hear me yelling at my dogs all the time, and they're like, "Would that crazy pastor just shut up?" You know what I'm saying? And like get a fence or something like that, so his dogs quit running away because they always run it over there. And that's what I think of, yelling and thinking, man, if I can get to you right now, you would be in so much trouble. You know what I'm saying? Like my hand would be flying, and it would not be good for you. That's what I think about when I think of wrath. Is this vengeful, this hate. I don't hate my dogs, but this mean. You are doing something wrong, and if I could just get to you, woe be unto you. I'm not sure that that's what God's wrath looks like. I'm not sure that's what God's wrath looks like. This guy named John Stott talked about it like this. Next slide. The wrath of God, then, is almost totally different from human anger. It does not mean that God loses his temper, flies into a rage, and is ever malicious, spiteful, or vindictive. The alternative to wrath, this is huge, is not love, but neutrality. In the moral conflict, thank you. And God is not neutral. On the contrary, his wrath is his holy hostility to evil, his refusal to condone it or come to terms with it, his just judgment upon it. When we hear God's wrath, we usually think of like thunderbolts, right? Like you've seen that picture of God with a thunderbolt just waiting, or the piano above people getting ready to drop, or earthly cataclysms, or flaming majesty. Instead of which anger in God, understand, is more of a quiet thing. what God's wrath might look like. We read it earlier, and it's going to come up 2 or 3 more times. That what the understanding of God's wrath might look like is this. It says it 3 times, and God let them do what they wanted. He gave them over to their sin. It doesn't say he struck them. It doesn't say he came down and was like, if I could just get to you, oh, woe be unto you. It basically just says all right, you want to go live that life? Another guy said, he said, wrath is not God's permanent attribute. God is righteous and holy and full of love. Like, God cannot be those things. But God's wrath is determined and here because of sin. If there were no sin in the world, guess what? No wrath. God hates sin. He hates it. So much so that he sent his son to die so that sin could be taken care of. He hates sin. And his wrath is not against people who are living. That's the outcome. His wrath is against the destruction and against the hurtfulness against people have with other people. The wars and the nonsensical killings and all that. Like, that just drives him crazy. Babies dying before they're born. People hurting each other. Like, he sees that and he's like, that just... His wrath is against sin, and he hates it. Once again, on the screen, Dr. Greathouse says, God's wrath in the present is his unremitting resolve to reclaim his rightful reign over a people in rebellion and on roads to ruin. It's not about an emotion at all. It's about God's personal reaction against sin. So how does God deal with sin? Presently? How does God deal with sin presently? Well, he's made a way that we don't have to live in it. But once again, 3 times in chapter 1, Paul says, and God gave them over. What's the punishment for sin? Sin. The consequences of sin. Human law. We don't have a punishment. Now, this may sound crazy, but I think it just shows the point. If somebody were to jump off of a skyscraper, you don't punish that person. Their decision results in their punishment. Right? And like sin, certain sins have consequences, which we say and Jesus says leads to destruction. And that is its own punishment. Have life and freedom and shalom and peace that God brings, or have destruction. But it's your decision. And whatever you decide, I'm going to allow you to walk down that path. And it's going to lead to destruction. It's going to lead to death. But it's your decision. God's wrath is expressed in his refusal to spare sinners from the consequences of their self-destructive folly. Their decision. So, in summary, and then I'm going to try to wrap all this up. So the wrath of God, for the wrath of God, is related to his righteousness, that his righteousness and his wrath are the same thing, because he loves for people to be holy, and he loves people to follow him, and his wrath burns against things that cause people to not follow him and to not be in love and to walk in relationship with him. When that relationship is broken, he's mad, he's frustrated, his wrath burns against that. For the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven now against all of God, the godless wickedness of human beings who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since that may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him. What's the chief end of man? To glorify God. They neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over. All right, you want to go worship all those other things? Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity and the degrading of their bodies. And they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator who is forever praised. So, what do we do with all this? Um, I think that the way we have to look at this and we have to understand this on some level is the understanding of life and death. Usually, when we think of life as now and death as later, but I don't know this, but they actually are both happening all the time. That death is more than when you take your last breath. Because we are either growing to be more like this or we're dying. There's no plateau. There's no, I've reached it, I've made it, I am good for the rest of my life. We are either growing to be more like Him or we're not. Um, so life is not just this physical, once again, understanding. And God gives you a choice. You know, we talked about a few weeks ago that our body recycles every week, and that after every 10 years, our whole body, bones and everything, we're a different person, we're a new person. Um, Death starts to happen when that ceases, right? That's when you're in trouble. When your body is no longer regenerating and your body is no longer remaking parts that need to be remade, that's when death is beginning to happen. And I think the same may be true for our spiritual life as well. If we're not allowing God to continually transform and renew and reshape and make us to be more like Him, then we're probably getting further away from who He created us to be. And here's the thing, God's not going to interfere with your choices. He's after you. He's like the hound of heaven. He is after you. He wants you to live like He created you to be, to glorify Him and enjoy Him forever. But He's not going to make you. We're not robots. He's not going to make you. He's after you. He's pulling. He's begging. He's pleading. He wants you to live the life that He created, to be human, to be who He created you to be. But He's not going to force you. It's kind of like we talked about, I think, before, but maybe not. The C.S. Lewis book. It's called The Great Divorce. You ever read The Great Divorce? Wow, it's like that thick. You know what I'm saying? Like so small, like 80 pages. In The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis paints this picture of this bus that goes down to hell and gets people on the bus and takes them up to heaven, and they get another chance. They get another chance to make things right. And he's not saying it's true. It's just a picture. Because he's trying to paint a bigger picture, I think, of the human condition. So the bus goes up to heaven, and what's interesting about the book, I don't want to give it all away. What's interesting about the book is the people get off the bus and they see the place, and people from their life come and greet them to try to get them to go and see who God is. Everybody gets back on the bus. Why? Because I think sometimes we have this understanding, it's like, I'll just live my life now, and when I die, I'll turn and be a good person. But did you know that you're going to be the sum total of all the decisions and thoughts and actions and the way you feel about people? Like, you're going to be the sum total of all the decisions you have made here in life in the end. And why do we think that that we're going to be a different person all of a sudden? Because to me, that would be like, then today doesn't matter. It's not important what I do today. I can just be the most vile person ever if I'm going to just somehow change. But at the end, you will be the sum total of all the decisions and thoughts and actions and everything that you did while you were here on earth is what you're going to be for eternity. So why, if you were this person filled with pride, do you think that, well, one day I won't be filled with pride when I just see it? So all the people see these people and think, well, if that person's here and they're so filled with pride, they get back on the bus us. And like, man, God let that person in. I don't want to be a part of it. There's this show on this new show on TV. Go to the next slide. It's called The Good Place. You may have seen previews. It's not a good show. It's not because it's bad. Just it's terrible. Like the storyline is awful. And but what I love, what was so interesting to me, is I think that this is the great divorce and a TV show. It's unbelievable. What happens is Kristen Bell, who's the lady, she has a name that's the exact same name as somebody else. Well, somebody messed up, once again, which was maybe not a great show, but somebody messed up in heaven, and she was a bad person, but somehow she got to go to heaven because she had the same name as the person that was supposed to go there. And it's her reaction of being in this good place and how everybody there is just so silly, has like raised money for charities and loved people and tried to help people. And she has been this most inconsiderate, vile, like evil for other, like doesn't help anybody, is all about self. So she's in this place where things are supposed to be the way they're supposed to be, good. And she's talking bad about people. She's like, how do you people do this? And she's the sum total. And it flashes back to her life and how she was mean to people and how she was rude to people and how she didn't treat people right and what that looks like. And she is still that person. And the premise of the show is she wants to become better so that she can stay there. Because she doesn't want to go to the bad place. If you don't worship God now, what makes you think? If you don't live like this now, what makes you think that one day I'll just flip a switch? God's asking and saying, the chief end of what you were created for is to glorify and worship me. If you want to worship other things, other idols, I'll let you. I'll let you. Man, if you want the freedom and the hope and the peace and the love and the grace, it's yours. Just live like I created you, but worship me with everything that you are. To the book of Proverbs. We're going to be done. Proverbs chapter 9. The book of Proverbs, wisdom is described as a lady. Okay, I'll be excited about that. A woman, which is probably very good and right. And we're just going to read a few verses and then we're going to be done. Wisdom has built her house, verse 1. She has set up its 7 pillars. She has prepared her meat and mixed her wine, or grape juice, Nazarenes. That was a joke. She has also set her table. She has sent out her servants, and she calls from the highest point of the city. Listen to this. Let all who are simple come to my house. To those who have no sense, she says, come and eat my food and drink the wine I have mixed. Listen to this. Leave your simple ways, and you will have life. Leave your ways. Leave the death and the destruction, and you will have life. Walk in the way of insight. Leave your simple ways, and you will have life. Walk in the way of instruction. So what about us? What are we living for? Is our chief end to glorify God and enjoy Him forever? Or are we chasing all these other things? Is our chief end to open relationship with God and others? And because right now, if you have hatred towards others, what makes you think that when you get to heaven, it's just going to be like wiped away? I mean, if you're filled with pride and this self and this understanding of I want things the way that I want them, like it's my way, and I know God says I should live a certain way, but I'm going to choose to live this way. Why do you think that when you get to the end, that if you're life has been heading towards destruction and death, that all of a sudden you're going to think, yeah, of course I want to live this way? Is your life leading towards spiritual life